The medic sat in his small, dimly lit workspace, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the soft flicker of diagnostic monitors. His solitude was broken by a sudden, fragmented transmission cutting through the static. The voice was alien, pleading, distorted by interference. He leaned forward, adjusting the frequency, catching glimpses of urgency and fear in the tone, though the words were incomprehensible. The coordinates were barely legible, but they pinpointed a location not far from his own position. His heart raced as he considered the situation. Answering distress calls in this remote sector wasn't just risky, it was often fatal. The terrain was treacherous, and he lacked the resources to fend off potential threats. Yet, he couldn't ignore the call. Memories of lives he hadn't been able to save in the past tugged at him. He ran his hand over a faded insignia on his uniform, a reminder of his oath to help, even in the most desperate situations. Quickly, he gathered his tools, checking and rechecking his medkit for the essentials. The scanner was outdated but functional. He loaded it alongside a mix of human medical supplies and rudimentary adaptations for alien physiology. A personal defense tool, though rarely used, was tucked into his belt, just in case. Navigating the rugged terrain, he steered his compact vehicle toward the source of the signal. The landscape was barren and hostile, the air thick with an oppressive stillness that only deepened his unease. As he approached the coordinates, he saw it a small vessel, half buried in the rocky ground, its exterior scorched and twisted. Smoke curled lazily into the air, mingling with the faint smell of burned metal and something organic. He climbed out cautiously, scanning the area for signs of movement. Nothing. The silence was unnerving. Moving closer, he saw the figure, slumped against a fragment of the ship, motionless. Her form was unmistakably alien, with a lithe, elongated frame covered in faint, bioluminescent patterns that pulsed erratically. Her breathing was shallow, each exhale accompanied by a faint, almost musical sound. The medic knelt beside her, his instincts kicking in. Her injuries were severe, multiple lacerations, signs of internal bleeding, and an odd discoloration spreading across her skin. Her biology was unfamiliar, but he noted key similarities: a rhythmic pulse, clear airways, and a circulatory system he could work with. His scanner beeped sporadically, unable to fully decode her physiology. He frowned, but pushed forward. Communication was impossible for now. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, reflecting a mix of confusion and pain. He spoke softly, his tone calm, hoping she could understand the intent, if not the words. She didn't respond, but seemed to relax slightly at his presence. Time was critical. He applied a coagulant spray to her wounds, watching as it struggled to adhere to her unusual skin. Using a diagnostic probe, he identified what he assumed to be the source of her internal bleeding and improvised a stabilizing solution. His hands moved quickly, guided by training and intuition, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The tools he had weren't designed for her physiology. He adjusted doses, recalibrated equipment, and relied on his instincts more than he was comfortable with. As he worked, the environment reminded him of the danger. The wind howled, carrying with it the distant growls of native predators. He glanced over his shoulder, his grip tightening on the tool in his hand. Time was running out, not just for her, but for both of them. With her vitals somewhat stabilized, he prepared to move her. Her body was light, her frame almost delicate, but there was a resilience in the way her muscles tensed slightly when he lifted her. He secured her into his vehicle, making sure she was supported. The journey back was tense, every sound and shadow a potential threat. His mind raced, planning the next steps, running through every piece of medical knowledge he had ever learned. Reaching the safety of his facility, he wasted no time. The table he used for diagnostics became an impromptu operating station. He connected her to monitors, though the readings were inconsistent. Her bioluminescent patterns flickered weakly, like a dying ember. He felt the weight of her fragility and the responsibility of her survival. Every decision was critical. He modified human equipment to fit her frame, using trial and error to stabilize her further. The language barrier and unfamiliar anatomy forced him to focus solely on observable reactions. When she twitched or her breathing faltered, he adjusted his approach. Slowly, her vitals steadied. The discoloration on her skin began to fade, and her breathing evened out. It was progress, but the road ahead was still uncertain. For the first time since finding her, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He looked at her, alien yet undeniably alive, her bioluminescent patterns now pulsing in a rhythmic, almost calming sequence. She was still unconscious, but there was hope. He wasn't sure who she was or why she had crashed, but in this moment it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alive, and he had done what he could. As exhaustion began to set in, he leaned back, staring at the monitors. The isolation he had once found suffocating now felt like a shield, a fragile bubble of safety holding them both. For now, at least, they were safe. The medic wasted no time after returning to the safety of his facility. His focus was singular, stabilizing the alien woman and ensuring her survival. He arranged his tools in quick succession, prioritizing essentials based on her condition. Despite the lack of familiarity with her physiology, he leaned on universal principles of life systems: oxygenation, circulation, and infection control. He worked methodically, checking her vitals and interpreting the erratic patterns displayed on the monitors. The immediate challenge was her internal bleeding. Using a modified diagnostic probe, he pinpointed the source of the hemorrhaging, though the equipment struggled to adapt to her alien anatomy. He improvised, utilizing adhesives and clotting agents designed for human injuries. It was a precarious process, requiring careful adjustments to avoid causing further damage. Each step was fraught with uncertainty, but he pressed forward, driven by necessity. As he worked, he noticed subtle cues in her body, faint luminescent pulses across her skin that seemed to react to his interventions. These flickers acted as a rudimentary feedback system, offering insight into her condition. When he applied a coagulant to one wound, the pulses grew steadier, encouraging him to continue. Her breathing, shallow and uneven at first, began to stabilize as he administered oxygen through a custom-fitted mask. Despite these small victories, complications arose. Her unique biology presented unexpected challenges. Some of her tissues resisted the sutures he used, and certain medicines triggered adverse reactions. He adjusted dosages on the fly, carefully observing her responses and recalibrating his approach. It was a delicate balance between trial and error, his hands moving with precision even as his mind raced with uncertainty. The monitors began to emit irregular beeps, signaling instability in her heart rate. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him as he scrambled to identify the cause. Her body temperature had dropped dramatically, likely a result of shock. He quickly initiated thermal regulation, wrapping her in heated blankets and applying a warming device designed for hypothermic conditions. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin dimmed momentarily, then gradually regained their soft glow, indicating partial recovery. Communication remained impossible. The alien woman was still unconscious, and her physiology was too different to rely on traditional diagnostic methods. He relied heavily on observational skills, studying her breathing patterns and the faint fluctuations in her skin's luminescence. These became his guide, a silent language he had to decipher to keep her alive. The hours blurred together as he worked tirelessly. Each step forward felt tenuous, every decision carrying the weight of life or death. The isolation of his facility, once oppressive, now felt like a sanctuary, shielding them from external threats. Yet the pressure of being the sole caregiver, with no margin for error, was immense. He knew that a single mistake could undo all his efforts. At one point, she stirred faintly, her fingers twitching and her eyelids fluttering. Though she didn't fully awaken, the movement was enough to reassure him that she was still fighting. He spoke softly, not expecting a response, but hoping the sound of his voice might provide some comfort. The words were instinctive, a blend of encouragement and determination, though he knew she couldn't understand them. As her condition stabilized, he turned his attention to infection control. The crash had exposed her to the harsh elements of the alien environment, and several of her wounds showed signs of contamination. He meticulously cleaned each injury, using sterilization techniques adapted from both human and alien protocols. The process was painstaking, requiring precise handling to avoid exacerbating her fragile state. The external environment posed its own challenges. The sensors in his facility picked up faint signs of activity nearby, likely predators drawn by the scent of blood or the heat signature of the crash. He kept a defensive tool within reach, his ears attuned to every sound beyond the walls. Despite these potential threats, he refused to be distracted, knowing that any lapse in focus could be disastrous. As the hours stretched on, the alien woman's condition showed gradual improvement. Her breathing became steadier, and the rhythmic pulsations of her skin grew more consistent. He continued to monitor her closely, adjusting treatments as needed. The process was exhausting, both physically and mentally, but he couldn't afford to rest. Every moment mattered. At one point, her hand moved weakly, brushing against his as he adjusted a monitor. The gesture was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to remind him of the stakes. This wasn't just a clinical exercise. It was a fight for a life. Despite the language barrier and the vast differences between them, the connection was undeniable. She was more than a patient. She was a being with her own story, her own struggles, and her own fight for survival. As her vitals continued to stabilize, the medic allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The challenges he had faced were unlike anything he had encountered before, but they had also pushed him to innovate and adapt in ways he hadn't thought possible. The experience reinforced his belief in the universality of life and the shared drive to survive, regardless of species. Finally, the immediate crisis subsided. Her condition, while still critical, had improved enough to buy them time. He leaned back, exhaustion evident in every fiber of his being. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin glowed softly, a silent testament to her resilience and his relentless efforts. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, for the first time since receiving the distress call, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. The alien woman began to recover slowly, her breathing more even and the glow of her bioluminescent patterns taking on a steadier rhythm. Though still weak, there were small signs of consciousness, a faint movement of her fingers, the subtle shifting of her head. These moments were brief but significant, evidence that she was beginning to fight her way back. The medic watched her carefully, noting every small change. He tried simple gestures, pointing to water and basic items around the room, hoping to establish some form of communication. Her response was limited, a slight glance, or an almost imperceptible nod, but these actions gave him a foundation to build on. He demonstrated simple actions, such as drinking from a cup, miming the steps slowly and deliberately. When she mimicked him weakly, it was a breakthrough. Even without words, there was understanding. As time passed, her movements became more deliberate, though still shaky. Her hand reached out to touch one of the tools he had used, curiosity evident in the way her fingers traced its contours. The medic realized that her awareness was returning, and with it, a desire to interact with her environment. He encouraged this cautiously, offering her harmless items to explore. Each small exchange brought a growing sense of connection. Her recovery also revealed more about her. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin seemed to shift in response to her emotions, glowing faintly when she was calm and dimming when she was distressed. These patterns provided a subtle but vital insight into her state of mind, a visual language that transcended the lack of verbal communication. The medic began to use this as a guide, adjusting his actions based on the intensity and rhythm of her glow. Despite their progress, there were moments of tension. She would occasionally react defensively, pulling away or emitting a faint, high-pitched sound that resonated in the small room. These episodes were brief, but spoke of trauma, a deep-seated fear likely tied to whatever had led to her crash. The medic responded with patience, maintaining a calm demeanor and giving her space when needed. Over time, these reactions became less frequent, replaced by a tentative trust. Their interactions expanded as she grew stronger. The medic showed her how to use basic tools, miming actions, and encouraging her to replicate them. She caught on quickly, her movements becoming more confident. When she successfully used a tool to help clean one of her own wounds, the moment felt monumental. It was a step toward independence, a sign that she was not only healing, but also adapting. The medic also learned from her. She demonstrated an uncanny ability to manipulate small pieces of technology, using gestures that seemed intuitive to her. When he offered her a damaged scanner to examine, she adjusted its settings with a series of precise movements, restoring functionality. This display of skill was unexpected, revealing a level of intelligence and capability far beyond what he had initially assumed. It deepened his respect for her and heightened his curiosity about her origins. Their bond grew in these quiet exchanges, built on mutual effort and a shared drive to overcome the challenges they faced. The medic began to feel less like a caretaker and more like a partner in survival. Though their worlds were vastly different, the fundamental need for connection bridged the gap between them. The fragile sense of safety they had built was soon disrupted. The medic's sensors detected movement outside the facility, unfamiliar, deliberate. He checked the monitors and saw faint signals, suggesting a search party or potential predators. The alien woman noticed his tension, her bioluminescence dimming as if mirroring his unease. He signaled for her to stay quiet, pointing to the monitor. She seemed to understand, her movements slowing, her expression focused. As the signals grew closer, the medic prepared defensively, securing the entrances and readying the limited resources he had for protection. He wasn't sure if the approaching figures were there to help her or harm them both, but he couldn't take the risk. The alien woman, despite her weakened state, moved to his side. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted rapidly, conveying a mix of determination and urgency. When the threat materialized, it became clear that their intentions were hostile. The medic and the alien woman worked together instinctively, her abilities compensating for his lack of strength. She emitted a brief, sharp sound that seemed to disorient the intruders, buying them precious moments. The medic used the distraction to activate a small energy barrier, a last line of defense that forced the attackers to retreat temporarily. In the aftermath, the medic saw a new side of her. Despite her vulnerability, she had acted decisively, demonstrating a resilience and strength that inspired him. It was a stark reminder that she was not merely a patient, but a survivor in her own right. This realization deepened their bond further, cementing a partnership forged in adversity. As they regrouped, the alien woman reached out to touch his arm, her bioluminescence shifting to a calm, steady glow. The gesture was simple but profound, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. The medic, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, allowed himself a faint smile. In that moment, they weren't just two beings from different worlds. They were allies, united by the will to survive. The alien woman, though still weak, began to recover enough to attempt communication. Her bioluminescent patterns, once sporadic and dim, now pulsed in deliberate rhythmic sequences. It became clear that these patterns weren't merely a reflection of her emotions, but a structured language. The medic observed closely, interpreting the shifts and variations in the glow as deliberate attempts to convey information. With trial and error, they found a rudimentary system to exchange basic ideas. Using gestures and symbols, she slowly revealed fragments of her story. She belonged to a race far more advanced than humanity, her mission tied to a critical event involving her people. The crash that had left her stranded was no accident. It was an ambush. Her damaged vessel had carried sensitive information, potentially vital to her species' survival. This revelation reframed everything. Her presence was not a random occurrence, but a thread in a much larger tapestry. The medic absorbed this information, aware of the implications. Her survival was no longer just a matter of individual compassion, but a question of broader responsibility. He realized that her enemies might still be searching for her, their motives tied to whatever knowledge she carried. The stakes of their situation escalated, and the medic began considering what measures he might take to ensure her safety beyond immediate medical care. Despite her weakened state, she insisted on demonstrating something vital. She reached for a small, intricate device that had been retrieved from the crash site, a piece of alien technology he had assumed was beyond repair. With deliberate precision, she activated it, revealing a projection of complex data. Though incomprehensible to him, her expression made it clear that the information was of immense importance. She gestured to him, her bioluminescent patterns intensifying as she attempted to convey urgency. The device emitted a faint pulse that resonated through the room, leaving a subtle warmth in its wake. The medic felt a peculiar sensation, as if the air itself had become more alive. He realized the device wasn't just a repository of knowledge, but also a conduit of some kind, capable of interacting with its environment in ways far beyond human understanding. She manipulated the device carefully, generating a holographic representation of star systems, pathways, and what appeared to be warning markers. It dawned on him that this was no ordinary map. It was a critical tool for navigating or avoiding a threat that her people faced. As the medic began to grasp the gravity of her message, she paused, her glowing patterns shifting to a softer, more contemplative rhythm. She turned to him, her expression carrying a weight of gratitude. Her actions shifted focus, and she initiated a sequence on the device that caused it to produce a smaller object, something that seemed custom-made. The object, smooth and iridescent, emitted a gentle hum when placed in his hand. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a combination of organic and technological material. She gestured to him again, this time more deliberately. The medic realized she was offering it as a gift, though its purpose remained unclear. Her glowing patterns conveyed a mix of gratitude, trust, and something deeper, an acknowledgement of his role in saving her and the bond they had formed. The medic, despite his reservations, accepted the object. As he did, the device briefly pulsed with light, and he felt a strange but comforting warmth radiating from it. The next phase of their interaction was marked by preparation. She began regaining strength and communicated her need to leave, knowing her continued presence would endanger both of them. The medic helped her piece together parts of her damaged equipment, using his own tools and ingenuity to bridge gaps between their technologies. Despite the language barrier, they worked in sync, their cooperation fueled by a mutual understanding of urgency. As they worked, she shared more about her people, though much of it was conveyed through gestures and the visual language of her bioluminescence. She showed him symbols that seemed to represent unity, knowledge, and resilience. The medic found himself captivated by the depth of her culture, realizing that her people had likely faced challenges that mirrored humanity's own struggles, albeit on a far grander scale. When the repairs were complete, the alien woman signaled her readiness to leave. She activated a small beacon, signaling for a retrieval vessel. The medic watched as the device emitted a sequence of lights, its function both elegant and efficient. Her people were coming for her, though it was unclear how long it would take. They prepared for her departure in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling over them. In the final moments before her departure, she turned to him and placed her hand on his, her bioluminescence glowing with a warm, steady light. It was a gesture of thanks, of farewell, and perhaps something deeper, a recognition of the connection they had forged across their differences. The object she had given him seemed to respond to her presence, emitting a faint glow that matched her patterns. It was clear that this gift was more than a simple token. It carried significance he could only begin to understand. When her retrieval vessel arrived, it was swift and efficient, a craft that seemed to blend seamlessly with the environment. She boarded it with a final glance back at him, her patterns glowing in a way he had come to recognize as gratitude. As the vessel departed, the medic stood alone, the object in his hand a reminder of the extraordinary encounter that had just unfolded. In the quiet that followed, he reflected on what had transpired. The gift she had left him wasn't just a physical object, but a symbol of something much larger. A bridge between their worlds, a reminder of the shared potential for compassion and understanding across even the vastest divides. He realized that her survival, and the role he had played in it, was a testament to the power of resilience and the unexpected bonds that can form in the face of adversity. The experience left him changed, his perspective broadened in ways he couldn't fully articulate. As he turned back to his facility, the object in his hand pulsing faintly, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The solitude that had once defined his existence now seemed less daunting, replaced by the memory of an extraordinary connection and the hope that, somewhere in the vast expanse of the universe, they might meet again.